If you thought we've gotten nerdy before, hold on to your keyboard because we're going deep into some technical specifics for the leading attribution platforms in this series. In this 4-episode series, we're bringing folks who are typically behind the scenes of these technologies, helping their customers succeed. And we're bringing them onto the main stage to share all their best practices, tips, and tricks, and all the stuff that everybody wants to know. And so I am joined today by Kate Colbert, who works at Adobe as a customer business advisor. And she helps Adobe customers with best practices and strategies around a lot of Adobe products. And she's also formerly from Visible. So when we talk about like Marketo Measure, Visible expertise, she's got years of experience. So Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Drew. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on the show. I mean, we've known each other and we've been working together for like 7 years. So anytime we get to hang out and talk shop is always good for me.
I know. I was trying to remember when we met, but I do think it's at least 7 years ago. I think you came to the Seattle office. I can't remember which one, but yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah, I went to the Seattle office, the Visible Seattle office, the one that was right above the brewery.
Oh, yes. That was the fun one. Times have changed.
So Kate, you had an interesting start in marketing technology as a BDR at Visible. How do you go from BDR to business solutions, or solutions engineer, to then business consultant? How do you translate and transfer to those different positions?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the space for a little bit now. Like you mentioned, I came from the Visible startup. I think I joined in like January 2017, so going on 8 years. And like you said, I started as a BDR. That didn't last very long. I think, as I was going and, through the onboarding and learning what you need to know to sell it, I just really became more and more interested in the technical side and how it works, all the details like that. I was definitely more interested in that than, cold calling and prospecting and all of that fun stuff. I think that was probably evident because I was encouraged to apply for the solutions engineer role, which I did. That worked out for me. And that, I think, kind of was like the trajectory of where I'm at right now. Solutions engineer was basically focused on implementation. Then Marketo acquired us. That's when I kind of got into consulting. Stayed doing that through the Adobe acquisition. And I think it was about like 6 years of consulting at Adobe. And then I kind of wound up here, the business advisory team. So it's still the same skills, but it's more, I'm not in there doing implementation necessarily anymore. It's more, like you said, kind of talking strategy, bigger conversations, as opposed to like, we're going to click this, we're going to do this. But yeah, I think starting at the startup when it was really small and kind of getting to try a lot, and you have to wear a lot of hats. I think that really kind of put me in a good position to be where I am now.
So how do you think, having sat in a seat like a BDR seat and being a solutions engineer, has kind of shaped your perspective now as a strategic business advisor? How do you think that like helps you give better advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've like seen it from all angles over the years. When I was a BDR, you're thinking about why do they want to buy it? You're looking at their website, kind of trying to figure out why why attribution could be a good fit for them. In consulting, you have to know the product inside and out. You need to know how it would typically apply for different industries. So I think just really time is like the biggest thing that like I bring to the table. Almost 8 years of working with like honestly hundreds of customers across probably all of the industries that are out there. So just a lot of, I guess, like a good bank of knowledge that I've built up, that I get to keep adding to, but bringing to the conversations that I have each day. And then just like being around some of like the best minds in B2B marketing attribution. I think I've been really fortunate to have that founding team of Visible, all my coworkers, hearing their approaches, their strategies, partners, and like thought leaders like yourself, been able to chat with you and others over the years. So I think that is kind of what probably shapes my perspective the most.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you might be one of the few people on the planet that's served more customers than I have in our 10 years, because I also got started with Visible back in 2017. My first Visible implementation was like early 2017. So we got about the same amount of time. I think you've just got a few more customers under your belt than I do, but there's not many out there that have worked with as many as we have. So yeah.
I mean, it's probably pretty close. It'd be interesting to see. I definitely did not keep strict track of it. I should have.
No, I haven't either. No. So I want to talk a little bit about the tools that you support. We're not going to do we're not going to talk about we're not selling them. We're talking about how to be successful with them. So with that said, we talked a lot about Visible, which is now Marketo Measure, but what all products within the Adobe suite do you support and work on?
Myself personally, I am working with, Marketo Measure, Visible, of course, and then also Marketo Engage. Those are the two that I support customers on today. I'm trying to enable myself on other ones, of course, but those two really keep me busy. The rest of my team supports, everybody kind of has their solution. But for me, those are the two that I support.
Okay, awesome. So then when you see clients that have these tools set up and they are absolutely kicking ass with these tools, and we'll focus more on Marketo Measure, but when you see clients that are absolutely kicking ass with Marketo Measure, what does that setup look like? What does good look like when you see a customer and you're like, oh, you're doing good. What does that look like?
Yes. I mean, my first answer, I wanted to say it depends, like the classic consulting answer. And it does depend, It depends on your industry, your use cases, all of that. But generally, if I'm going to go look at an account, I kind of have a quick little checklist that I run through to get a kind of a pulse check that's generally going to tell me how this instance is health-wise. And I mean, at the highest level, clean and simple is going to get you the furthest. But kind of beyond that, I first kind of start at channels and making sure that we've got a variety of channels that are incorporated, because if Measure doesn't see it, it's not going to be in the reporting. Checking for things like, are we being good about what is online and what is offline in a Measure sense, right? Are we not? Are we avoiding double counting? That's kind of a common thing that I see. And when I say double counting, I should explain. I mean, not tracking something with offline channels that the JavaScript would be handling. Those are really the foundations. Oh, I would be remiss if I didn't mention spend. Looking for spend. The marketing CSV is the only option for digital spend that we don't have an API integration with. And I think that is a big kind of myth that I see a lot. And so that is kind of a conversation that I'm having a lot of the time of why that's important and making sure that we're doing that so that we can ROI reporting. I know there's a lot. That's kind of where my head goes to first.
Okay.
What about you?
I mean, I would say the one that I was going to comment on is spend. I mean, you cannot get ROI if you don't capture the I part of that calculation, right? Mm-hmm. You have to have the investment. And it is unfortunately one of those things that there's no automated way to get a cost for something like a trade show or a webinar into the system. You just, it doesn't work that way. So somebody's got to manually key that in somewhere, which means that it's a manual, at least some level of manual effort, which means it's the biggest pain in the ass. And therefore it's the thing that always falls through the cracks that nobody does and nobody keeps up with. So I mean, I think that if I see somebody that's inputting spend diligently, I'm pretty confident in they've got the other stuff pretty locked down. I mean, if you're doing that well, that's like the canary in the coal mine. If you're doing that well, the canary's fine,
Right. Yep. That's one of the first pages I go to is the spend. And I'm pretty sure that when I go check on their connections and their suppression logic, that's going to be in a good place too. If they're, handling the spend.
Yep. Yep. And I think that one of the things that one of the words that I think is important in what we're talking about here is the word diligence. There's a certain amount of diligence that has to go into these platforms to make sure that we're spitting out good, actionable, clean data, right? Like without that diligence, that's where people start using UTMs that we don't even know exist in the platform, and therefore stuff gets miscategorized. So I think diligence is one of those things that is super important. But it's also just really easy to be diligent about things.
Yeah, no, you're spot on with that. And, sometimes it's like a stretch at the beginning, but once you get it down and are able to be consistent with it, it's obviously great for Measure, but really for all your other platforms and reporting, needs as well. It just kind of like cascades. Like it's not just about the attribution.
Yep. Agreed. Yeah. The other comment that you made that I think is super important, because I'm personally a huge advocate for this, is you mentioned simple. Don't overcomplicate things. Like the sign is here. I'm going to tap the sign that says simplicity scales, complexity fails, because simplicity is one of those things that is just, I think a lot of times people make things more complex than they need to be. And then it just adds more things that can go wrong when you add that additional complexity.
Right. And yeah, I think for me, like what I've learned is if a customer is asking me a question, usually I'm not just going to spit the answer out, depending, but usually I'm not just going to spit the answer out. It's kind of more, okay, why are you asking me that? Where are you coming from? Because sometimes that makes it irrelevant because we're not thinking about it maybe the best way, or maybe there's no like strong need to do it. So I really resonate with that.
Cool. So we're gonna shift gears a little bit in this mini series. We actually have a suite of questions that we're asking everybody because we want to get a bunch of best practices out there. There's no right or wrong answers here, Kate. So we're gonna start with UTMs. We know UTMs are super important for any attribution platform, Marketo Measure included. What are your UTM best practices?
The word diligence comes up. Consistency with UTMs. I'm sure everybody will hit on that in some capacity. But I think to really expand on what I mean by consistency is figuring out how we're going to use those UTM parameters, right? How are we going to use UTM source? How are we going to use UTM medium? And sticking with that, not using them interchangeably so that we can have clean reporting outputs is big. And then I think another thing is being intentional and not just doing it, not just making sure we're using UTMs, I should say, just because it's on the best practice list, but really thinking about the why. What are our interests in reporting? What are those nuances or kind of granularity that we're trying to get at? And let's make sure that we are filling our UTM parameters to get those results, right? Not just kind of having the random, like, I know I have to have a UTM source, I'm going to throw something in here. Like, let's really think about it so that we're getting the most out of it.
I think the comment that you made about medium and source not being interchangeable, I think I want to expand on that a little bit. So I see this happen all the time where we come in and somebody's got, for example, paid social as a medium. And it's like, cool, great, that's a medium. That's a great medium to have. But then in some cases, they also have paid social in the source. And it's like, no, it's a medium, not a source. Now, quite frankly, it doesn't matter if you pick medium or source for paid social. What matters is you don't flip-flop every once in a while because you feel like it. If paid social is a medium, it's always a medium and it's never a source. If paid social is a source, it's always a source and never a medium. Like that's the key thing there.
Exactly. Like, I don't care how you're going to do it. I'm sure there's some people that have like a philosophy for this is how you should use source. This is how you should use medium. I don't really care as long as we're consistent, like you said.
Yeah. We have a philosophy that I like to use, but again, the most important thing, rule number one, is consistency. Because if you break every other rule that I have, but you do it consistently, then we're going to be fine. Yeah.
And we get a pass. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about spend, so we're gonna dive into that one a little bit. How should marketers be keeping track of and inputting costs into systems? Like, what are some of the best practices that you see around getting spend into the system?
Yeah, I mean, if we're being honest here, like this is one of those tasks that's never going to be the most fun thing that you're doing at your job. But we can't overstate how important it is to be doing. So best practices obviously is to do it. That's kind of like my basic like plea here, is to do it. But I think the best practice is figuring out, for me, my best practice is figuring out how is going to work best for you, your organization, and sticking to it. So not picking some strategy that's beautiful and great, but not something that we can realistically commit to. It's finding what is going to be what we can do. So beyond that, because I know that's kind of high level or more like conceptual, I think like tactically, best practice would be to be accounting for your spend monthly, maybe quarterly, but I would say no more frequently than monthly and no less frequently than quarterly is kind of the sweet spot in terms of timing, if you will.
I would agree with that timing. I would agree with that timing wholeheartedly. I think we typically recommend monthly, just because if you do it quarterly, like it's just such a pain in the ass to go back and look at, okay, well, it's October. So what did we spend in July? Well, that was so many months ago. Like, it's not easy to get to that. It's a lot easier to get to what we spent in September. So we typically go monthly as well.
I think monthly, yes, forces you to keep it more simple and up to date. And I was just thinking, I think like beyond that, like another best practice would be to just make sure, this sounds obvious, but sometimes it gets lost, just to make sure that you have a dedicated person, maybe plural, maybe persons, but this definitely has to have an owner. This is not something that we can assume somebody else is going to do, right? If somebody doesn't own it, it's not going to happen. So just throwing that out there, a dedicated owner is a must.
I love that you said that because first off, I think you're the first one in this miniseries that has said that spend should have a designated owner. Plus, we're going to talk a little bit later on about ownership and how attribution should be owned in an organization. So a little bit of a segue coming down the road here, but I totally agree that you've got to have an owner for this. If it's that old concept that like if 3 people own something, then nobody owns it, right?
Right. If everyone owns it, nobody owns it, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, next one here is Marketo Measure is very reliant upon Salesforce campaigns and campaign members. So what are your Salesforce campaign best practices?
Yeah. So these best practices are going to be, relevant to Measure, but I think also just for clean Salesforce usage in general, like even if you didn't have Measure, I would say consistency, right? Figuring out how we're going to fill out the different, fields on the campaign and sticking to that and being, again, intentional. How are we going to name our campaigns in a way that it is easily digestible and recognizable, because that campaign name is one of the most, commonly used fields in Marketo Measure. So making sure that we're able to get out of that what we need and not kind of having varying names or like varying orders of codes or abbreviations, things like that is big. Let's see here. I think another one that I do recommend, I feel like most customers are doing this these days, but not always, but I think making sure to have one campaign per initiative. So for example, if you're doing 5 webinars, you're going to have 5 Salesforce campaigns. You're not going to just keep adding to one campaign. Having the 5 campaigns is going to give you the granularity so that you're able to see, Drew attended 4 of them, right? Because you're able to put him in 4 different campaigns. And I feel like that goes through a lot of platforms, like multiple or individual programs in Marketo, right? Like it's not just Measure, it's kind of like a best practice across the board.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into the next one, which is what about Marketo program best practices? Because you can also use Marketo programs to create touch points in Marketo Measure. So what about Marketo program best practices?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of the same, right? Because they're basically the same concept, just in different platforms. And as we know, programs, the relationship with Salesforce campaigns, I'm thinking of that flow chart that we have where it's like program channel goes to Salesforce campaign type, right? So kind of just, it's the same principle of being thoughtful and consistent with our channels in Marketo so that we can have, clean campaign types in Salesforce. Beyond that, I think with Marketo, this goes for Salesforce campaigns too, but definitely for Marketo, is being very careful with how you're organizing program membership from a perspective of we don't want to double count what the JavaScript is already tracking. I run into this like a lot where a customer, maybe they have, let's say an ebook and it's on their website where the JavaScript is tracking it. And maybe sometimes they give it to a partner or somebody else and it's on that person's website where we can't put the JavaScript. That's great. You can do that. But we probably don't want to put that all in one program because then it's kind of impossible to be able to sync just the people who came from the partner's form submission versus the people on your website where the JavaScript is already tracking. So that's a really big one that I've seen a lot, and a lot of companies that kind of have that situation have had to rework.
I love that comment about making sure that you aren't duplicating touch points that are already handled by the JavaScript, because we see that a lot as well, where there's a lot of overlap between those two, and that's going to muddy the data because then you're going to have, 2 touch points for one action potentially, which is just that's not good. So I think that's a really good call out there is making sure that we aren't double counting touch points by overlapping the touch points from the JavaScript with touch points from the programs and campaigns.
Yeah, so it's a very common challenge, but there are solutions. There's ways to account for it.
Absolutely, yeah. So the last one in this group of questions is, how should marketers be thinking about reporting ROI on things like brand or harder to measure channels like a podcast, for example?
The toughest question for the end of this section. No, in all seriousness, questions like this are good when they come from customers because it really shows me that they have the basics down. They're very competent there, and they're kind of pushing the boundaries when it comes to attribution. It's challenging, like for podcasts, for example. That's definitely not the easiest thing, but it's doable, right? You can have vanity URLs. You can have special codes, maybe like Attribution 2024 or something. There's ways to do it. It's not impossible. You have to be more creative. Brand, I feel like for thinking about brand, that is more of a kind of like a conceptual thing usually. And at least for me, you can't necessarily think about it in the same mindset, like, tying to a touch point. Like you can tie, here's Drew's touch point for attending the webinar or listening to this podcast, right? You're not really going to have a touch point for the brand. I mean, maybe you have like, brand campaigns on Google Ads, and then you'll have a touch point, but that's kind of like a fragment of thinking of the overall umbrella of brand. So that one's tough. That kind of makes me think of the conversation that we had at Summit when we sat down for coffee. You're kind of telling me about a lift analysis, how you can kind of, look at your regular attribution and your trends, and then you can be like, okay, well, we did a big push on overall, brand building in this period, and then you can kind of see what's different, right? So I really loved that. That was awesome, and I think that is kind of the conversation to have when there's questions about measuring brand as it relates to attribution.
Yeah, I think the thing that you mentioned about podcasts that I want to just kind of touch on real quick is you mentioned having like, vanity URLs or like offer codes or something like that. I think that's one of the things that a lot of people miss about podcasts. So, you have we know that like the click-through rate on like podcast show notes is abysmal. It's just how it goes. That's the reality. You can't change that. The only thing you can do is try to increase that or give somebody a reason to go to your website. And I think that this is one of the things that gets missed a lot with podcasts. And I'm guilty. I haven't done this for any of our podcast episodes yet or miniseries, but so many people don't wrap like an offer into anything around their podcast. If you have an offer of something, people are measurably more likely to go to your website to claim an offer than just out of sheer curiosity. Like it is such a huge accelerator of people going to your website. So having a vanity URL that leads to an offer or having an offer code of some sort so people can redeem an offer is one of those things that I think a lot of people are just completely missing the boat on when it comes to getting value out of podcasts. And it's the reason why is it's tough. It's tough to think of an offer that is, you know, unique to a podcast episode or unique to a series of podcasts. Like, I honestly don't know what my offer would be. And before anybody says a free trial is not an offer, a free trial is not an offer. Everybody offers free trials. So that's not an offer. But like, it's hard to think of what a good offer would be to incentivize somebody to come to the website because they listened to the podcast and heard the offer. And it's tough. And so I think a lot of people miss that opportunity. But I would say probably 99% of B2B podcasts are missing that opportunity.
Right. That encouragement or reason to keep moving further. What if you did, for this specific situation, what if you did a one-pager or like a guide on how to track podcasts?
Funny thing is, we already have a blog article that's free. So like, you know, like I'm not, again, it's because it's already free. It's not like it's an offer to people that listen to the podcast. That's why it's so difficult to think of like, well, what's a good offer? Because like, what would you normally charge for or gatekeep or something like that, you know, would be compelling and valuable. It's tough. That it is the toughest part about trying to, you know, monetize a B2B podcast is figuring out like, how do I convert this to revenue? And I think the biggest challenge and the biggest missed opportunity is an offer.
Agreed.
All right. Our next section here, Kate, is we're going to talk a little bit about some misconceptions in the attribution space. So one of the biggest misconceptions that we see all the time is that companies need perfect data before they can do attribution. So what's Kate's opinion on this? Do companies need perfect data to get started with attribution or not?
Well, no, because perfect doesn't exist, right? We're always going to be working towards that. And we're never going to get there. So no, I mean, you don't have to have perfect data to get started. Obviously, if your data is completely out of control, you have gaps in data collection and, I don't know, crazy issues going on, then yeah, maybe spend a little time getting that under control. That's probably a priority. But in general, no, I don't think that that's a concern. And actually, bringing in a tool like Measure can sometimes be like a kick in the pants to be like, okay, we're going to, you know, get our house in order. We're going to actually keep it in order. So that's kind of typically what I talk about when it comes to that. I haven't heard that in a while since I don't do implementations anymore, but I get why that would be a concern. But no, I don't feel that you need to have perfect data.
Totally agree on the whole kick in the pants thing. Absolutely. Yeah. 100%.
Right. Yeah. It brings the fire to get things under control.
Absolutely. Now we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier on about ownership of costs and spend. So how big of a team is needed to manage an attribution platform? Because I think a lot of people think like, oh, I'm going to have to go hire 10 data scientists to manage this thing. How big of a team is needed to manage Marketo Measure?
I'm not one for specific numbers. From my experience working with people, there's definitely no one answer. There's no one size fits all here. But what I have observed, I will say that generally the smaller the team, the more effective or successful it will be when we're talking of things everywhere from, getting set up and implemented, right? Because not too many cooks in the kitchen with different opinions or kind of going back and forth on things for too long. But then also truly using the reporting and incorporating it back into their operations. Smaller generally works better. But I guess to be clear, I'm not saying that it has to be small, right? That's definitely not what I'm saying. You can make it work, right? I would say that just if it is a bigger team or cooks in the kitchen, you really have to make a concerted effort to make decisions and move on in action, right? Not kind of get like stuck in like groupthink or not making a decision because you think somebody else is, all of that. So I think it's something to be aware of and push past and make sure that we've got ownership.
Okay. You said a word and I want you to expand on it. You said groupthink. I love this word because I think I know where you're going with this, but in case our listeners don't know where you're going with this, can you expand on what you mean by groupthink in this context?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, when you have a bigger group, right, maybe people don't want to speak up and share their opinion, maybe because it's different than somebody else's, or maybe somebody says something and we kind of latch on to it and we're like, that works. And we kind of go with that instead of maybe thinking more creatively or kind of thinking outside of the box a little bit. I don't know if that's the exact definition, but that's kind of what I think when I refer to groupthink.
Okay, awesome. I appreciate that because I think that I agree wholeheartedly that if you have too big of a team, groupthink can kind of weasel its way in there and cause issues. And just to kind of give an example of how that might impact like an attribution system is, so if you are running, let's say you're running a multi-channel campaign, and an aspect of that multi-channel campaign is brand, right? And we're in a meeting where we're talking about, okay, what is our measurement strategy for this multi-channel campaign? And somebody comes in and says, well, this can't be measured, so we don't even need to worry about it. Mm-hmm. Well, is that true, or is that just that person's opinion? With groupthink, everybody would just say, no, that person's right. That it can't be measured, so we don't need to bother worrying about it. When in reality, it might be something that is either measurable or we just got to get a little creative. So I think that's where groupthink can kind of cause some issues with attribution. Is one person says something, they have some authority, everybody else just falls in line, and we don't actually challenge that assertion. Right. or that opinion or that direction or whatever. I think it can also come into play a lot when it comes to like the analysis of data. Somebody says, oh, well, here's what the data is telling us. And it's like, is it though? Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the things that comes up with groupthink.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's just more likely the bigger the team is, right? But if you're aware of it and you kind of, try to be aware of it and move past it, it's okay.
Yeah. All right. The last question is a little bit more personal one, so people can get to know Kate a little bit. If we have time, I always like to ask this one if we have time. I'm a huge music fan. I love listening to music when I'm doing like deep work. So, like, what are you listening to these days? What could be artists, genres, bands, like what's on Kate's playlist right now?
Yeah. I feel like this is almost the toughest question. Music is so personal. I don't know. I think for me right now that we're kind of like into fall, I feel like I tend to listen to maybe more like indie or alternative music. Definitely in the fall. It just kind of fits the vibes, the mood, right? And I guess if we want a specific example, Rainbow Kitten Surprise is one of my favorites. I'm going to their concert next month. Yeah. And I know the name is a little out there. When I first heard it, I thought it was like like EDM or something, but it's definitely not. It's more like indie alternative.
Okay, I've definitely not heard
Yeah.
of them, so I'll have to give them a listen.
You
Um,
should let me know.
I will for sure. I'll circle back and let you know. Yeah.
I know it's your podcast, but do you get to share what you're listening to?
I mean, I think the shirt is a good representation of the type of music I listen to, which is mostly harder rock metal stuff. So, but I do have like my guilty pleasure, particularly when I'm like trying to focus on work, is I love listening to film scores, like the
Oh,
orchestral music in the background of like movies and stuff. So like I'll put on like the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, like it just helps my brain focus on work. It's
interesting.
there's no words, there's no lyrics, but it's super familiar because like I've seen the
Right.
movie, right? So like it's
Hmm.
super familiar. So that's the one like weird kind of like little guilty pleasure that I have. So
Interesting. Well, I'm getting a little work hack out of this.
all right. Well, to close out this episode, we like to kind of close out with some key takeaways. So in case our listeners, don't want to listen to the entire podcast, they can fast forward to the end and get the takeaways for free. I think some of the things that I learned from you today, Kate, that I think our listeners can take away as well is there was 3 words that came up a lot in our conversation. There was consistency, there was intentional, and there was diligence. And I think that those 3 words, how frequently they came up, like it's important for people to know that in order to be really good at marketing data and marketing attribution, you have to be consistent, you have to be intentional, and you have to be diligent. So those 3 words were really big. Another one that came up a lot was clean and simple. Keep things clean and simple. The cleaner and simpler things are, guess what? The easier it is to be consistent, intentional, and diligent. So keep it clean and simple as much as possible. Another one that came up is spend. Sometimes you just got to bite the bullet and do it. Like the best way to report on ROI is to get the spend in the system. We all know it's going to be a pain in the ass, but you got to do it. You can't measure ROI without the eye. So you just have to do it sometimes. And then another one that I really, really liked that you mentioned and we kind of expanded upon it was give some, like for things like podcasts that are more difficult to track because of like low click-through rates and like that, give somebody a reason to come to the website. Like give somebody something that's going to incentivize them to come to the website, like maybe a special offer with an offer code or something that can be tracked. Like give somebody a reason to come to the website. So those are my big takeaways. Kate, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. I think our listeners are going to learn a ton from this episode. So yeah, thanks for joining. Really appreciate you joining.
Thank you so much, and great job summarizing. That was perfect.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.